Yesterday we talked about how we organize and talk about ecosystems. We're going to spend today talking about the feeding relationships in ecosystems. Ecology is really about how organisms and non-living things interact and affect each other and influence each other. And a large part of that has to do with feeding relationships. It has to do with energy and how energy is transferred from one organism to another. So that's what we're talking about today. So, energy is a very important part of every ecosystem for all living things. Okay? Energy is one of the requirements of life. All living organisms must have a source of energy. We know this from studying it early in the year. It's one of the needs of living things, a source of energy. And we also talked back then about all of the energy really on Earth comes from one main source. What is it? Right?
The sun.
The sun. Yeah. The sun is the main source of energy for all life on Earth, for the most part. And then you could think about any food that you eat. You can trace it back to the sun's energy. That's what, when you eat, crispy chicken nuggets? You're going to eat some crispy chicken nuggets next period. That chicken came from chickens, which ate what? No? They ate grain, probably some sort of grain, corn and stuff. Where did the corn get its energy? From the sun. And you could do that with any food that you eat. You can go back and trace that energy, and it all comes back to the sun. Mark?
Well, technically, the chicken nuggets are like chicken or something else.
Well, whatever it is, we can still trace it back to the sun's energy. So, we'll do it. I'll do it. So the name for an organism that can directly use the sun's energy. So we all use the sun's energy. We cannot use it directly, though. We can't get our energy just from going and laying in the sun. That's not how it works. But there are some organisms that can, such as what? Plants. We call these things producers. And really, it's not only plants. There are bacteria that are producers. There are even some protists, when we study euglena, that are producers. So a producer is an organism that can use the sun's energy to make its own food. Producers don't need to go out and eat other organisms for energy. They can use the sun's energy directly to make food for themselves. So yeah, we're usually, when we talk about producers, most of the time we're talking about a plant. Another term for a producer is autotroph. Troph means having to do with food. Auto means self. So it kind of means self-feeding. So, if you're thinking about the courtyard ecosystem, the producers out there are the grass and the trees and the bushes, the weeds in the lawn. Those are all the producers.
So, and didn't we talk about autotrophs and anatrophs?
Did we?
Yeah.
When we talked about the kingdoms, because we said our plants, yeah, we did, you're right. All right, then we have consumers. So if something cannot make its own food using the sun's energy, then it's a consumer. Meaning, to get energy, it has to consume other organisms. We are all consumers. We eat other organisms to obtain energy. The term for a consumer, does anyone remember the other term? Abby? Heterotroph. Heterotrophs means other feeding, so you have to feed off other organisms. So in the courtyard we have some birds, some bacteria, maybe some squirrels or some ducks in there. Those are the consumers. Worms in the soil, insects, all of those are consumers. We also have another group that are decomposers. Decomposers are organisms that help return nutrients back into the ecosystem. They recycle dead organisms. They break down waste products. So if a worm out there in the courtyard dies, it's going to decompose. What that means is bacteria and fungi are going to break down the tissue of that worm, and then the chemicals that were a part of it are going to return back into the ecosystem, be recycled. And then plants are going to use them again. So we have this cycling of nutrients in an ecosystem. When we think about decomposers, usually we're thinking about fungi and bacteria, our main decomposers. So those are some important terms that you'll need to know. Producer, consumer, and decomposer. Ed? Sort of. Some, it's a little more complicated than we're making it sound like they're scavengers that eat things that are killed by another animal, which technically aren't decomposers, but do sort of the same job. All right, so when we are thinking about an ecosystem, and we're thinking about how energy moves through the ecosystem, we can create diagrams that we call food chains and food webs. And food chains basically just show us in an ecosystem how energy is transferred from one organism to another. It shows predator and prey relationships. It shows what eats what in the ecosystem. Now, the area where people are sometimes confused is in the direction of the arrows. So in a food chain, in a food web, the arrow goes from the prey to the predator, from the thing that was eaten to the thing that ate it. You could imagine it, the arrow showing, like if a snake eats a mouse, the arrow showing the mouse going into the snake's mouth. The arrow points toward the snake. The arrow is showing the way energy is flowing. Energy is going from the mouse into the snake that ate it. A food chain always starts with what? No. Well, we usually don't include the sun because it's not a living organism. So if we go one step after the sun, starts with a producer. Let's say in this case wheat, for an example. Wheat growing in a field, that's a producer, it's a plant. It's using the sun's energy. Let's say that wheat is eaten by a mouse. So energy goes from the sun to the wheat, then from the wheat to the mouse, as the mouse eats some of that wheat. And let's say a snake eats that mouse. And let's say an eagle eats the snake. So we're looking, and the arrows are showing us which way energy is flowing from one organism to another to another. So the wheat's the producer, the mouse, the snake, the eagle, those are all consumers. Now sometimes we label them first level consumer. That's the thing that eats the producer. And the second level consumers, they eat the first level consumers, and the third level consumers, and so forth. Call that their trophic level. So this is a simple food chain. Food chains always go one species directly to another to another. But really they're not that realistic, because a mouse doesn't just eat wheat in an ecosystem. An eagle doesn't only eat snakes. Most species have multiple food sources, but that's not shown in a food chain. We do show it in a food web, though. As we're talking about ecosystems, we have some terms, and I guess you probably know what all of these words mean. So, raise your hand if you could tell me. What is an herbivore? Michael? Yes, it's an animal that eats only plants. I am an herbivore. What is a carnivore? Daniel? Yeah, it's a meat eater. An animal that eats only other animals. When we talk about these relationships, we have predator-prey. A predator does what? Huh? It eats other animals. It's a hunter. What's the prey? The hunted. The animal that was eaten. You are all, or most of you, are omnivores. What is an omnivore? Nicholas? Yeah, an organ that eats both plants and animals. Are there any other fellow vegetarians? Just me and mine. Okay, how about heterotroph? What does it mean again? Heterotroph. What's a heterotroph? Somebody, we just went over this. Right?
Something that gets energy from another animal.
Yeah, from another animal. From something that has to go out and hunt for its food. Eats other animals. Cannot make its own food. Finally, an autotroph. What is an autotroph? Huh?
It can make its own food.
Yeah, it uses light. It uses sun to make its own food. Sorry, hold on. Uses the sun to make its own food. So in this little diagram here, we have a food chain. We have the sun, which is being used by algae. Those are the producers. Those algae are eaten by tiny little insects in the water, which is being eaten by a larva. It's a carnivore. It's eaten by a perch, which is eaten by a bass, which is eaten by Mr. Fisherman here. All right, so how is a food web different than what we just talked about, a food chain? So they're similar in a lot of ways. Tori? It's more specific, it's more realistic. It shows interconnections between several food webs. It's an accurate depiction. It shows many connected food chains. So for example, here we have a plant that's eaten by shrimp or a crayfish. It's eaten by the fish, the bird eats the crayfish. So it's a little bit more complex. So it's a little bit more realistic. So we could have, in this food web, we have a couple different food chains. We have plant to shrimp to fish to herring. Or we have plant to crayfish to herring. Okay, so there are multiple food chains found in this food web. Now, if we think about an ecosystem, let's think about the one I was just talking about. We had, earlier we made a food chain of wheat, mouse, snake, eagle. If you imagine that ecosystem, out of those 4 species, which do you think there is the most of? Raise your hand if you want to tell me what you think. Ready? Yeah. What do you think would be the second biggest group? Garrett? Mice. What do you think would be the fewest in that ecosystem? Abby? The eagle. And that is true. That's because of this thing we call the energy pyramid. This energy pyramid tells us that as one level goes to another, we end up with less and less energy each step along the way. It shows how many of the different species, or how much of that species there is in an ecosystem. Because energy, every time one species eats another, there's energy that is lost along the way. Let's say you eat some chicken nuggets in next period. Let's say you eat 6 ounces of chicken nuggets. Does that mean you are going to gain 6 ounces of weight? No. What happens to much of that? It gets burned off in your daily activities, to maintain your body temperature, to walk around and so forth. You could really usually only use about 10% of the energy that an organism consumes is available to become new body tissue. So every time one thing eats another, 90% of the energy is lost. Only 10% makes it to the next level. So if we imagine the ecosystem with the wheat, we have a ton of energy in the wheat. Only about 10% makes it into the mice. Only about 10% of the energy from the mice makes it into the snakes. And only about 10% of their energy makes it into the eagle. So every step up we go, we have less and less energy, and that's one of the reasons why we have fewer and fewer species. If you imagine, what is like, if you think of a big carnivore, what's a species you would think of? Right?
Bear.
A bear. Do you see herds of bears walking through the forest? No. If you think about it in the ocean, what's the top carnivore in the ocean? A shark. Do you see schools of thousands of sharks swimming through the oceans? No, there's very few of them in comparison to other species. That's because they're at the top end of this pyramid. They're the top consumers. There's not enough energy to support that many sharks in one area. Only 10% makes it to the next level. 90% of the energy is lost along the way. So in an ecosystem, we always have the most producers, and we always have the least of the top carnivores. Abby?
Wouldn't there also be able to be like more after a while more eagles because they ate all the mice and
Yeah, but there's not enough energy to support that many. There can never be as many eagles as there are mice. Or there can never be as many eagles as there are snakes. Because only 10% of the energy in the snakes is available for reproduction and growth of those eagles. Again, here we have a diagram. It shows us in the ocean. If the sun's shining with 500,000 units of energy, okay, the algae, plankton can take in some of that. Only 10% makes it into the next level, the tiny little organisms. 10% can make it into the small fish. 10% makes it into the big fish, and so forth. So each step along the way, there's less and less energy available. Again, this is another view. Here we have a plant, and we have an herbivore, and we have a carnivore, and then another second level carnivore. So each step we have less and less energy available. There's another, is this a food chain or food web? It's a web. It's several food chains. Here's one food chain. The berries to the squirrel to the fox. Here's another one. Berries, grasshopper, frog, owl. So this is many food chains connected to each other. There's another food web. Which species do you expect there to be the least of in this ecosystem? Yeah, the eagles. They're the top carnivore. Only about 10% of the energy goes to this level, and 10%, 10%. So there's not a lot of energy available for those top carnivores. Name one food chain you can identify out of this illustration. A food chain. Eddie.
frog's eating a plant, and then the snake's eating a frog, and the eagle's eating a snake.
Okay, give me that in the proper order. So what would our first box be in our food chain?
Grass,
Grass. Arrow goes towards
frog,
frog,
snake,
snake,
and then
eagle. Which species of that Eddie just named would you expect there to be the most of? The grass, the producer. In this picture, what's a producer? Consumer? Oh, yeah. And what's the fungi? Yep. All right. Let me give you your homework.
Oh, we have homework?
Science homework? Yeah. But the good news is